So recently, Gad Saad had the Canadian professor Jordan Peterson on his podcast. And Jordan Peterson, you might know him, is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. And for the last few years, he's been a pretty outspoken critic of this gender-bending silliness that we see everywhere. No differences between the sexes and blah, blah, that sort of thing. And more recently, he's come out against the insanity directly, openly standing in front of crowds of SJWs and their ilk, and trying to make his point. Now, during this discussion, he made a really important point with reference to freedom of speech, which I'm going to reiterate here. This is not my point, it's his. To paraphrase, he was saying that the importance of free speech lies not in the ability it grants you to insult or engage in an inflammatory discourse or just be a dick. That's a byproduct, fortunate or unfortunate, of what free speech is. The importance of free speech is the ability to engage in open discourse, so ideas can be sorted out and properly assessed, and as a consequence, one can arrive at a correct conclusion. It's the gist of what he meant. It's not a perfect citation, but I thought it was important to mention that at the beginning of this video. That, of course, will not necessarily be the focus of this video. The focus of this video is far more on the fact that freedom of speech as an abstract concept is not something that most people value per se. They don't think, yes, open discourse and the exchange of ideas, and that's why we must have it, particularly when those ideas are not attractive to them or even repellent in many cases. Free speech to most people, and most people are some form of ideologue because naturally they gravitate towards a certain political ideology. They have a certain direction they go in. And this is a consequence of their genetics, their environment, their psychology, and perhaps most importantly, their neurology. There's been quite a bit of study on this in recent years, and perhaps I'll cover this subject, the neurology of politics, in a forthcoming video. Perhaps not. But the point is that people get attached to certain political ideologies. And freedom of speech, generally speaking, isn't part of that, unless you're a hardcore libertarian. And that has its own pitfalls, of course. But they tend to value freedom of speech for the convenience it offers them. And when do they do this? They do this most often when they're in the position of being an underdog. So if we go back in time to the 50s during the McCarthy era, and of course the early to mid-60s, when leftists and liberals and the pushers of multiculturalism were very much an underdog class, politically speaking, people who generally didn't favor the established system. Well, back then, freedom of speech was a really important attribute of the American political scene and legacy. The right to speak your mind, even though many people don't agree with you, because they were in an underdog minority position. Now, if we fast forward from that time to the current year, to use that ever so popular phrase, what's happened? Well, we don't really have the freedom of speech that they used to enshrine. And now you see, of course, pushback from the right, in particular from the alt-right, but also other subsectors of the right, pushback basically emphasizing the importance of free speech. Millennial Woes made a video about it, the importance of free speech. And as much as I like Millennial Woes, I have to question his attachment to the principle as an abstract. Not biased against him as a person, but generally I have this feeling that we're at a certain stage at this point in time where the right in general, as a group comprising many different factions, but a group nonetheless, is the underdog right now. They're the ones in the position being beaten down. And so, of course, they value freedom of speech. They want freedom of speech to be available. And it's perfectly understandable. I understand it, and I think everyone can understand it. But my concern with freedom of speech as an individual, with my own particulars and my own particular viewpoint, is that it is an important thing for the sake of open discourse, not because it allows certain ideological positions, although it does, to express themselves. And I think that's a marked difference between myself and those people who view freedom of speech in that light and other people. Now, I'm not a First Amendment fetishist or someone who thinks of the First Amendment in almost mystic terms or properties. Oh, the First Amendment. But it is damn bloody useful for the purposes of open discourse. But this is the reason, all the things I've just cited, why I don't really trust the left or the right, and why I consider myself as an individual to be a member of neither. It's true for the time being, I have a lot of intercourse with the right, and particularly the alt-right, and I talk to people, reactionaries and what have you. And that's because paths sometimes meet and they then diverge. At this point in time, talking to people in an underdog position is useful because it's useful for getting ideas out. Some of those ideas will be bad and others will be less bad or worse, as they say. But that's the way I see it. I don't trust the alt-right. I don't trust really any of these factions in the right reactionaries. And I certainly don't trust the left. And the interesting thing, and I've talked about this before, is that having ascended to a position of dominance and power, the left now, of course, is generally speaking against what they consider hate speech. They're not really for free forms of expression. And even though technically, according to the First Amendment in the context of the United States, less so in Canada, you are permitted to say what you want, there's certain things you can't say because it will affect your livelihood or your career or your reputation or all of the above. And this doesn't just apply to political factions, obviously. Different religious and ethnic groups try to promote policies that protect them from what they perceive as slander or libel, or just really name-calling, even in the simplest form. I think of Islamophobia. Muslims don't like it when you say what they perceive to be bad things about them. Jews are pretty similar to this too. Most Jews get completely on board with speaking out about Islam, but the minute you say something about Jews or Jewishness or Israel or whatever, that's anti-Semitism, and it shouldn't be permitted. And to the extent that it is permitted, I mean, yes, you can criticize Jews, but if you're in a position of authority or in a mainstream position in an office or some place where there's a lot of social interaction, you'll be shunned if you publicly offer criticism, and you'll probably lose your job. So it's not just political factions, but ethnic and religious factions that also tend to oppose freedom of speech. Notice how none of these groups, whether they're the politically aligned left or right, ethnic groups such as so-called ethnic groups such as Jews, or religious groups such as Muslims, really have any value for freedom of speech other than its utilitarian value for them as a group. And then there's that small faction that I belong to. I'm not a libertarian anymore, but who believe that you need freedom of speech for the purposes of open discourse. Ideas can be harmful, but they can also be beneficial. And one would hope that having that open discourse allows for the correct conclusions in the end, or the most accurate conclusions regarding certain ideas. Not everyone agrees with that. I know several figures on YouTube who tend towards authoritarianism and favor that. I chatted with a gentleman fairly recently who thought, well, if freedom of speech hadn't been something in effect at the time, all these immigration laws and multiculturalism, none of this would have come to pass. I guess that's true to some degree. And so we need to put caps on freedom of speech. I mean, the problem there is it just becomes arbitrary. What do you put caps on? Well, of course you put caps on freedom of speech when it's offensive or deleterious to your so-called group, what you perceive to be your group, whether it's religious, pseudo-ethnic, or any combination of the above. So when I look out at the vast landscape of politics and all these people, I don't really see allies. I see people who are kind of useful for the moment. I can like them as individuals, despite Millennial Woes, for example, his almost obsessive quality regarding white nationalism. I think as an individual, he's very thoughtful and reflective, and I like him. But I don't see a political alliance there any more than I would see a political alliance with people on the left. I mean, they're in power now, the people on the left. But his vision isn't my vision. And his value of freedom of speech isn't perhaps my value of freedom of speech. I mean, we've gone through centuries, if not millennia, with real caps on freedom of speech. And the American experiment, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not applying a mystic quality to this or trying to turn it into magic, was a pretty good one. I mean, freedom of speech, the right to exercise, express yourself in writing, to criticize people without having to worry, about going to jail or having your head lopped off, in the case of insulting monarchs or people in positions of power. A very valuable thing to have. And whilst no one's having their head lopped off these days, you criticize certain groups or criticize certain ideas because they're, frankly speaking, just wacky, such as just all feminism, but specifically third wave feminism and SJWism and fuzzies and furries and all these freaks out there. Well, you won't have your head lopped off, but you can lose your job. I mean, there's a certain amount of decorum, I guess, that plays into freedom of speech. But most people just don't see it as a valuable thing in and of itself because it promotes the exchange of ideas. Now, sometimes freedom of speech, it still doesn't work. I'm always reminded of my exchange with Sargon of Akkad and Spinosaurus Kin, the teenager, where the entire conversation just sort of wound down to, let's not offend people and just call it something else. Fair enough. Ideas don't always penetrate, but the platform that's available that allows you to express those ideas is a very important one. YouTube, of course, is a private entity, and so they can curtail freedom of speech if they want. It's up to them. But I'm talking about the larger setting of Western civilization. There have always been principles of etiquette, of course, interacting with people, things you don't say in polite company and blah, 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 blah. But we're at a stage now where we de facto don't really have freedom of speech. The things I talk about in my channel, for example, are absolutely intolerable and inadmissible to your typical normal, or rather normie conversation. It just wouldn't happen. People would look at you as if you're a five-headed hydra or a freak. Nobody would accept this stuff as even plausible, or even, as I said, even admissible for a topic of conversation. So I think those of us who value freedom of speech for the principle that it represents, which is to say to protect and uphold open discourse and the exchange of ideas, rather than as a tool of leverage for the sake of some ideology, whatever that ideology might be, we really need to be wary about where we stand, I think. I don't really trust anyone politically. I don't trust religious tribalism. I don't trust ethnic tribalism. I don't really trust any of it because people are tribal. I mean, and there are different kinds of tribalism, of course. There's political tribalism. There are mixtures, ethnic and political religious political tribalism. But none of these guys are really dedicated to the purpose of exploration of ideas and knowledge, and that's kind of my thing. I really think that's the most important thing in life. I'm castigated for that because I'm not chasing after women all the time, but I do think the understanding of the world and the human condition is the most important thing we can engage in, and everything that we do that forwards that goal is a good thing. Then within that context, I suppose you could argue, well, then freedom of speech is useful to your ideology too. If you want to consider understanding the human condition and improving the human condition ideology, I suppose you could say that. But as far as the more mainstream ideologies are concerned, I don't trust any of them. And we need to bear this in mind, those of us who value freedom of speech as a principle for the exchange of ideas and the promotion of human knowledge. Because rest assured, one day if the right ascends to power, they will try to curtail freedom of speech just like the left has done. Neither side is trustworthy. It's true at the moment the left tends to have the wackier ideas that tend to be far more detached from reality, but that doesn't tell you very much. I mean, if we had an authoritarian right-wing government or a mass media that were allowing those lines, then, I mean, yeah, the left would start complaining, and I might end up shocking having dialogues with them. But the purpose of freedom of speech is not just to protect certain interest groups. It is to allow for the exchange of ideas. I think Jordan Peterson really nailed it on the head when he said that. And I will be linking to that video so you can check it out. But we need to be wary of political factions, of ideological groups that seemingly promote freedom of speech, because I think they promote it because it's expedient to them at the moment, and that moment could extend for decades. I mean, the alt-right, for example, is a nascent thing, and maybe for the next 2 or 3 decades they'll say, yeah, freedom of speech, until we get into power and they say no more freedom of speech because it's bad for white people or it corrupts society or whatever. We just need to be aware of this moving forward. Until then, I will offer the parting, an amalgamation of the parting ingredient of Styx Witchhammer. Hey, YouTube, that's all for now. So I'll check you guys out later. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.